Okay, welcome to the lecture on grief processes, one that I think of as pretty much the heart of the class and my favorite lecture. And you'll hear me say that word favorite throughout this because I have favorite terms and favorite frameworks. This is also marks the beginning of our unit on grief. So we finished our unit on dying. So how I've set this up is I'll give you just some introductory material, then we'll go into key terms, and then we'll talk about theories and models. Okay, so historically in the United States, we have had a difficulty accepting grief. I've been giving lectures on grief for now 30 years, and I think this has changed. You can, in some ways, you can give your input on that. I feel like overall, especially younger generations, are a lot more accepting of talking about difficult emotions. But we still have this around, and many of you may experience this in your lives, that we tend to think of kind of being strong as being stoic, and we tend to think of people who are openly expressing emotion as being weak. Okay, here's some principles by Jeffries about grief, and I've reworded these as statements that you could say to someone who is grieving. Even though we're not going to be getting more into specific helping for a couple of more modules, what we're learning here is the foundation for how you're going to help. And so these are all ways that you could educate people. So you could say, for example, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. People really like hearing that because they feel like they're doing something wrong. We can't fix grief. We can't take the pain away as much as we would like to. We can only move through it. People will often ask, how long will I feel this way? You can say there's no set timeline for grief. We would say things like, you might imagine you have 100,000 tears to cry for them, and maybe you cry most of those in this first year, but you could be crying some of those 10, 20, or 30 years from now as well. You can expect that it will be more acute in the first 6 months and year and will begin to lessen over time, but it can still move up and down. Every loss is a multiple loss. We'll be talking more about primary and secondary losses, but every time we lose something, some person, some animal, we lose everything that they brought to our lives. And so it's like this domino. All change, whether it's good change, equals loss, equals grief. And we're going to be talking more about that with non-death losses. Also, we grieve any old losses we've had anytime we have a new loss. So it's not unusual to be experiencing a new loss and then re-grieving people or animals that you've lost in the past. And then we also grieve after a loss has occurred, but we also grieve in advance of that loss, and that's called anticipatory grief, and we'll talk more about that. Here's a bit more about grief that you could translate into educational or normalizing statements for people. But grief affects all aspects of our lives. We'll talk more about this with the manifestations of grief, but it affects us physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. It occurs for all ages, and we'll be getting more into that in our developmental unit, from little kids all the way up to older adults. Grief can be immediate, but it can also be delayed, and we'll talk more about delayed grief, and it can be disguised. We'll get to that even more when we talk about complicated grief. But for example, it can be disguised as risk-taking behaviors or irritability or anger, right? Grief is a wound that requires both time and attention. You'll often hear people say time heals all wounds. And as a grief counselor, what I often said back to that was, yes, time helps, but it also matters what you do with that time. And I've met people who lots of time has passed and they really haven't moved through their grief. So the more you can lean into it and make it active, the more you can move through it. Grief is both predictable. We know we're going to experience it with significant losses, but it also is so unpredictable and can be very challenging for us because it catches us off guard. You're having a good day and then something triggers a reminder, or you just wake up feeling off and you can't figure out why, but it probably is grief related. And grief is about moving forward, integrating the loss continuously in an ongoing way. You're never going to go back, unfortunately, to how you used to be. You can't get that life back as much as you might long for it. And so you're going to be a changed person, kind of taking what you can from maybe this person's life or the experience of losing them as you move forward. So I hope you'll come away from this class realizing that you've experienced a lot more loss than maybe you thought. Because there's not only death losses, but there's all the non-death related losses. These might be things like leaving home and coming to college. This could be relationship breakups. This could be your parents going through a divorce or you going through a divorce. It could be giving up a substance, right? It could be moving apartments, or it can be graduation is a huge transition that involves loss. It can be positive things like getting married or having a baby. And certainly during the COVID-19 pandemic, many of us experienced enormous losses, around just especially if you were at a time where you were graduating from high school or starting college, there were a lot of milestones there that you missed, not to mention other things as well. I thought it might be nice to just see a list of potential non-death losses that you or someone close to you could experience, because if it's someone close to you, it's also a loss for you. For example, if your parents divorce or they experience a health crisis or a change in financial status or abilities. I've always loved this work by William Bridges on transitions, and what he says is all transitions have 3 stages. They begin with an ending. That's okay for us to grieve. And then we move to the limbo place where things are out of sorts. We don't have our feet under us. We haven't kind of gotten things figured out. It's a period of uncertainty, ambiguity. Most of us don't like it. We want to just get to the new beginning, and feel solid and set, but it can take some time to get there. So for example, I'll share with you that I'm going through an addition on my house. And so I've definitely been grieving, even though this is something I want and it's generally positive. I'm grieving the changes. I'm grieving my old bedroom. I'm grieving that we watch TV in this tiny little living room, on this tiny little couch, all crammed together. And even though now we're going to have more space, we won't be just all cozied up anymore. In terms of limbo, I keep reminding myself that it's not going to be all perfect and set up for months, maybe years, right? That I'm going to feel like it's not really ready or not really right. And that's going to be uncomfortable for me because I want to get everything in order and have everything just like I want it, right? Decorated and set up and figuring out where everything goes. I want to get to that new beginning, but I'm going to have to spend some time in limbo first. So I'd encourage you to just take a moment, think about a transition that you've been through and see if you can apply these stages. Perhaps like when you came to college, you hoped that it would be this exciting new beginning, but it actually took you 2 years before you even found your people or the things that you wanted to do. Let's get into key terms. And again, I want you to think of these not as things you should be memorizing for a test in this class, but words that you can be remembering to share with people who are having that experience to help them feel coherent and normal. Okay, so the first term here, I already mentioned anticipatory grief. This is grieving in advance of a loss, and people are often worried that they're grieving too much or not grieving enough, right? But grieving too much is like, what's wrong with me? My dad's still alive. Why am I grieving him so much? And we can say, yeah, that's anticipatory grief, right? Or it might come out, people might, after a loved one dies, be like, I'm not grieving them as much as I thought. And you might say, well, you were grieving for months, even before their death. And so it makes sense that you might not be grieving quite as much following the death as you would anticipate. Delayed grief is, again, something normal, especially when you've got a lot happening, whether that's a lot of other kind of simultaneous life events, or maybe just even in the short term, you're responsible for all the logistics around the funeral and finances and just all the things you have to do. And so people can feel guilty for not grieving enough. And so it's nice for us to normalize that for them as well. This is another super useful term. It was coined by Pauline Boss, ambiguous loss. She started this idea by interviewing families who had experienced the kidnapping of a child. And so this being an ambiguous loss, the child was perhaps still physically alive in the world, but not in their lives, right? And still psychologically present for them. But it was unclear, right, what exactly they had lost. Same thing applies to people who are missing in person. But then there can be other ways that death events or non-death events can have ambiguity to them. So anytime there's a death event where there's mysteries around how the person died, because you don't know if it was a intentional drug overdose or an accidental drug overdose. For example, certainly around 9/11, people didn't know how their loved ones died. Did they jump? Were they crushed? Were they burned? I mean, it's all really hard to say. And that not knowing creates more challenges for grieving. When there's not a body, like 9/11 or after plane crashes, or it's never been recovered, that makes it harder because there's just more unknown. As far as non-death related losses and ambiguity, breakups can be that way. This person's still alive in the world, but you're grieving them. Dementia can be that way. They're still physically present, but they're not themselves anymore. Or just maybe losing a family member to addiction, right? They're still there, but you can't really have the relationship that you were hoping for. Anytime there's ambiguity, it's challenging. So disenfranchised grief is when we don't really validate a loss as a society. It's not kind of socially supported. It used to be that pet loss was this way many years ago. There was that it's just a dog, get another one. For same-sex couples, the loss of a partner used to be a disenfranchised loss because you weren't even seen as kind of valid, maybe public partners. Now it might be things like we're going to talk more about miscarriage or abortion, not seen as real losses. Or what if you leave an abusive partner? Your family and friends are often relieved and glad, and they don't want to hear about you grieving kind of the things that you've lost as a result of that. Even though, your gains are worth it, you're grieving the good things, right? Or what if you're losing a loved one to prison? Kind of a disenfranchised loss, we could say, or disenfranchised grief. We could use both of those terms. What happens if you're divorced and later your ex-spouse dies? Maybe you're not kind of seen as a valid griever because you're divorced from them. So society doesn't know how to mourn losses around perinatal death, abortion. It's a choice, and so people might not think that you're allowed to grieve that. Adoption is seen as a positive, like, yay, you're adopting, or yay, you were adopted, how lucky. But there's a tremendous amount of loss in giving up a baby for adoption, or being adopted and having to kind of grapple with that. And so if we can bring a grief and loss perspective to that, it would be, much less disenfranchised. Miscarriages. When a baby dies in utero, if it's 20 weeks or less, we call it a miscarriage. If it's 20 weeks or more, we call it a stillbirth. Miscarriages are incredibly common, but most people don't realize it because it's not something that we talk about. I had a miscarriage between my two kids, and I didn't realize how common they were until I began talking about it and hearing from other people. Sometimes people have miscarriages, by the way, and they didn't even realize they were pregnant. Just your period seems a little late or a little bit heavy. And miscarriages and stillbirths, they've been treated like medical events rather than deaths. And we're beginning to change that. Hospitals are changing their protocols to allow family members, especially in the case of stillbirth, when the baby is more well-developed, to, bathe the baby, let the family hold the baby, make footprints or fingerprints, have, a burial, right? It used to be kind of treated like, let's just dispose of the tissue, really, and not kind of have this kind of ceremony or ritual. And maybe people can even take bereavement leave and, things like that. So, but people can feel there's no script for this, and so you can feel like, is it okay that I'm experiencing this much grief? Is this inappropriate for me to still be sad years later? People can often struggle with questions around identity. Am I a mother? Am I a father? If I don't actually have a child in front of me, but I was creating a child within me, or my partner was. And it can feel very isolating. It's very different now whenever your friends or family members get pregnant or have babies. Baby showers are, never the same. When people say things like, wow, well, you're lucky you only have one kid. You don't have to deal with all that we have to deal with three. You're thinking, well, I actually wanted more than one kid, but I couldn't have that. So there's a lot of where you feel like you're not part of the real parent club in some ways. These two terms, regrief phenomenon and anniversary reaction, overlap, and I wouldn't ask you to know the difference of them on an exam. Regrief reaction is when you have grieved a loss at the time, but then later in life you're regrieving it. So, for example, like let's say your mom died 10 years ago and now you're experiencing the death of someone else close to you, you might find yourself regrieving your mother as you kind of process this new loss. Anniversary reactions are so important to be aware of so that you can help other people be aware of them. So certainly we notice these in the first year. These are all things around dates, right? Birthdays, death dates, holidays. But then they can get more complicated. So for example, if I'll just tell you, I worked with a client who was in his early 40s and he was really depressed and having a hard time figuring out why it had come on. But it turns out that his dad had died of a heart attack also in his early 40s. And in the couple of years that he was like 41 and his dad had died at 43. And he was just subconsciously both re-grieving his dad and worrying about his own life expectancy. I've noticed myself that, let's say, for example, I had a hard time when I was 9 years old. I noticed that when my daughter got close to 9 years old, I was reprocessing some of those difficult events in therapy. They just kind of came back up for me. Why I think we experience these regrief and anniversary reactions is because our memories in our brains are simply just neural nets, right? Neurons that wire together over time. And so we can have both conscious and unconscious experiences. Like consciously we experience a new death and we realize that that's connecting to our thoughts about a previous loss, right? But it can be also unconscious. So for example, these are things like the way the light is, the way the air feels, a smell, a sound, a date that you're not even kind of conscious about. I often will hear people say, gosh, I've been so irritated or so tired or so depressed. And then I just finally realized that tomorrow's my mom's birthday, and she died. And so now I know what's happening. My general experience is that people will experience that kind of re-grieving or that anniversary reaction in advance of the date. And then once the date passes, it usually abates. My husband, for example, had his dad die of a heart attack. It's been more than a decade now, on May 13th. And what I noticed, especially in the years following, is that in like somewhere around the end of April, he would just start not being quite himself. He would be irritable. He would forget things. He wasn't paying attention to what I was saying. And I would realize, it would take me a while, but I'd say, what, I think you're grieving your dad. And he would say, I think you're right. It just kind of happens subconsciously a lot of the time. Pathways Hospice for many years had a Surviving the Holidays When You're Grieving event in November to help prepare people who were grieving for just how to get through the holidays in November and December. And so here's some examples of things, and you might have other ideas too that you could share. So first is just understanding you might have more limited energy, being realistic about what you can take on, feel like you can say no to some things if you just can't handle it. It is a good idea to try to continue some traditions, and it's also a nice idea to create a new tradition, or you might even think of it as a grief micro ritual that somehow honors your loved one or honors this new phase of life. It doesn't actually have to be to do with the loved one, but it can be small things around just flowers or candles for them, or a prayer or a reading in their honor, making their favorite food, playing their favorite game, singing their favorite, holiday song, visiting wherever their remains are, whether that's burial or cremation, maybe leaving an empty seat at the table, putting up a picture of them in a prominent place. And then definitely it's a time to have a family meeting, review your traditions and reallocate the roles, because maybe this person who died used to do a lot of things, and now we need to figure out, do we want to continue this, and who's going to take it on? I think during the holidays, you're bound to be having lots of memories of your loved one at that time. And so coming up with a way to record those, perhaps in a kind of joint or group format where we have a list, in the kitchen, and as something comes up, we write it down, or we go around the table at dinner, each night that we gather and we share the memories that are coming up for us. Or some people have suggested you could have a memory box or a memory stocking that you put things in and then take a time to read them out. Definitely a time to increase self-care, and people often suggest, taking some of the focus off yourself, although definitely we want to give permission to grieve and not be just all upbeat, but doing some things that help make you feel grateful, helping others, volunteering can also be a benefit. Two other terms good to be able to pass along are just this idea of multiple losses and bereavement overload. And so people will often, again, feel like there's something wrong with me, I'm not grieving enough, or I'm falling apart too much, and it's okay to just normalize and say, yeah, you're experiencing bereavement overload. It's just been too much in a short amount of time. All right, here's some of my favorite terms: primary and secondary loss. And so you can think of a primary loss, whether it's a death or non-death loss, as the actual event, the stone being thrown in the pond. And the secondary loss is all the ripples that have happened as a result. You could also think of them as the dominoes, right, that have fallen. And so we'll be getting into some examples of secondary loss, but I'll just share like a specific non-death one, right? My son's getting ready to graduate from CSU Boulder, and so I was just reminding him again of this idea of non-death losses and secondary losses. And so I asked, what else are you losing when you graduate? I know it's exciting and you're proud and you're gaining some things, but what are you losing? Is it your apartment, your roommates, your daily life, your social life, your identity, this time period in your life, your dreams of what college was supposed to be that, didn't materialize? And so it's really helpful to help people put words to their secondary losses, because those are often some of the most powerful aspects. And it's like by just putting words to them, they can then acknowledge them and grieve them. When I was working with grievers, I often we just wrote down lists of all the secondary losses. So here's some examples, and I'd encourage you to be thinking of what are some primary losses and the secondary losses that have resulted from that. And then how can you be using this understanding to, help support other people? So you're not just going through a divorce, you're losing all your extended family too, or not only did you lose your husband, you lost what he brought to your life. Somebody that you love to travel with, financial security, someone who gave you physical affection, all the future dreams that you had together. Okay, so you can test yourself here on this question. If the death of Angela's sister is the primary loss, what is an example of a corresponding secondary loss? And it would be loss of her sister's support. A few more key terms. Vicarious grief happens when we don't have a direct relationship with the person or the event or the animal who has died, but we still have a reaction. So when we think of celebrity deaths and our grief, when we think of watching movies or reading books and the grief that we feel for these fictional characters, we can also experience vicarious grief when we're helping professionals. So for example, we didn't really have a close relationship with them, but we find ourselves kind of taking some of that grief home. I noticed for me, as a grief counselor at the vet school, I actually experienced the most vicarious grief when people were not expressing their own grief. If they were very stoic, or they didn't want to be present when their animal was euthanized and I said I would be, then I kind of took on more of the grieving. Traumatic loss we're going to spend more time talking about when we talk about complicated grief in the next module, and we'll also talk about sudden death at the end of class, and that has a big element of traumatic loss, anything that's kind of sudden, violent, out of the norm. And then complicated grief, again, we're going to be talking more about, but the best way to describe this is when someone is stuck. And not just stuck for a few days, but stuck for months or years. They just don't seem to be progressing in their grief. Okay, here's another iClicker, or test yourself question, I should say. Chloe's dad died suddenly when he was 45 and Chloe was just 20. She actively grieved his death throughout her early 20s. However, when she's 43, she starts experiencing uncharacteristic depressive symptoms. This could be a sign of what? And in this case, it's not delayed grief, because delayed grief implies she didn't grieve initially, and she did. It's not complicated grief, because it's also really normal to have these re-grief reactions. It's probably best an anniversary reaction. Her dad died when he was 45, and she's now 43 and starting to kind of put herself in his shoes, re-grieve him, and wonder about her own, longevity. Okay, so moving into theories and models of grief. We're going to start with manifestations of grief. Again, my absolute favorite. So we're going to be talking about these 5 different areas of manifestations of grief: physiological or physical, emotional, intellectual, behavioral, and spiritual. Just in general, I find myself saying things to people who are grieving that just convey that grief affects us in all these areas. So you can see grief, what I might say, grief affects our bodies, our minds, our emotions, our behaviors, and our worldview. Or I often find myself writing in a text to a friend, you're managing so much physically, mentally, and emotionally right now. So physical or physiological manifestations, there's so many of these here. People will feel kind of tightness in the throat or chest, difficulty breathing, stomach ache, nausea. That tightness in the chest can actually make people worried that they're having heart attacks. People have gone to the hospital thinking they're having a heart attack, and it's grief. Feeling restless, feeling exhausted, trouble sleeping or eating, body aches, stiffness of joints or muscles, dizziness, fainting, are all examples. In addition, research indicates that in the year following a significant loss, whether that's like a death or a divorce, people are more at risk for getting sick themselves and more at risk for example, having accidents like an automobile accident. And so just reminding people to take care of themselves and be safe can be a good strategy. I hope as we go through these, you'll be thinking, what of these have I experienced, or do I know that someone else has experienced? Emotions. It's really important to just tell people that grief is more than sadness. There's so many emotions that can be tied up there. Numbness, shock, anger, depression, guilt, anxiety, relief, and then guilt for feeling relieved. For example, if you were a caregiver for someone or worried about someone a lot, and now they've died and you don't have to worry or caregive anymore, you might feel relieved and then feel guilty about that. Feeling irritable, wanting to blame other people, feeling resentful, embarrassed, feeling overwhelmed, out of control, hopeless, helpless, and also kind of that inappropriate affect, like that kind of nervous smile or laughter, feeling nothing, apathy, yearning, regret, anxiety, right? Because grief makes us feel so out of control. So just listening for these, and we'll eventually talk about how we can normalize and name those for people. Intellectual, also cognitive or mental. So the early ones there are a lot of that, like just having difficulty concentrating, feeling distracted, forgetting things. And then also people can be spinning in their minds, rumination, but also that magical thinking, like if only I had told them to drive safe, or if only I had said I love you, that this wouldn't have happened. Feeling like you have control that you didn't actually have control over. Hallucinations, so it's not unusual for people to think they hear, see, smell, feel a loved one, be it an animal or a person, following their death, but they often don't. And sometimes it's actually that person or the animal who died, and sometimes it's other kind of beings, coming to them in dreams or visions, or they have a very real sense that they were holding their child that died, or they hear their grandfather's voice talking to them in their house, even though he has already died. So people confess these things to grief counselors and are sure that they're going crazy, right? And so it's important to normalize that and say, we don't know why that happens. You can make sense of it how you'd like, but it is a common, not an uncommon, I should say, experience. Behavioral manifestations. A lot of these, are kind of how we might cry or withdraw from social activities or get clingy and more dependent on others, struggling to ask people for help, not having an interest in normal kind of daily activities, being more hostile, having outbursts, being irritable, going out of our way to avoid things that we think are going to be too painful, like, no, I can't go to that movie theater, or I'm not going to drive by the school, or, things like that. Substance use to cope. This desire to change your living arrangement or your social situation. It's kind of like you're hoping to outrun the pain or avoid the pain, but it usually doesn't work. And so we want to caution people from making drastic changes when they're grieving, especially in the short term. And then, of course, there can be positive things like we've talked about, all the rituals that we do to honor loved ones. Spiritual manifestations. So these can be things like feeling angry at God, having renewed, shaken, or changed religious beliefs, feeling blessed, feeling punished, this kind of searching that we do for why did this happen, or where are they now, those questions about afterlife. So for example, my mom's sister was killed in a plane crash right before I was born. And my mom spent kind of years worrying about where she was in her afterlife. There was no body. She just was kind of doing this spiritual searching until she had a very powerful dream in which her sister came and talked to her in her dream several years later, and said, Liz, I'm okay. I'm whole. I don't want you to worry about me. People can have also just that change in worldview, like the world just doesn't seem the same anymore. And they can also find things that, like looking for signs, right? This butterfly, this bird, this something that is related to my loved one. We can see those signs as kind of an indicator that they're present or with us or they're okay. My hope is just by seeing all of these different types of manifestations, you already feel more normal in your own experiences, and that you can pass that normalization on to others. All right, let's get into a few other models. Okay, so factors influencing the grief process. This should look familiar to you because we had a very similar model when we were thinking about factors influencing the dying process. But I'm going to talk you through this using my husband as an example when his mom died, Audrey. So first we'll start with the bereaved. That's Jordan. So a little bit about him. No strong religious beliefs or thoughts of afterlife. He was almost 50 when his mom died, and he was really sad that she didn't see him live to see 50. He also felt just different because he had very few friends who have had both their parents die. He tends to, in general, minimize his distress and focus on tasks or training, athletic training, but he does allow himself to grieve. He had experienced the death of his dad 10 years before, so he'd already had experience with what it was like to have a parent die, but he also was feeling that profound experience of now being an orphan in the world. A little bit about Audrey, the deceased. She was his mom. She lived in the same town. We saw her regularly for brunch or lunch, kids' sporting activities, and she actively took care of our kids when we were young. He had a close relationship with her, an appreciation of her strengths, and I would say an acceptance of her challenges. The death event, it was inevitable. Pancreatic cancer. It was a very fast and painful dying trajectory. It was challenging that it was that fast, but also really hard to see his mom in that much pain. The pain was very hard to manage. When she died, we were not present. We were coming back from a trip. She died. We expected her to live a few more weeks, and so we had gone away for the weekend. Jordan's sister was there with her, so that helped that someone was present at the time of death and she wasn't alone, but that created a challenge for Jordan not being there at the time of her death. So it was an expected death that had that element of unexpectedness as well. In terms of social factors, I think Jordan has pretty strong social support, open conversations with his immediate family, with my parents, with his sister. And we went to a family reunion about a week after, and we initiated a memorial service there for anyone who had died, but Jordan talked about his mom at that service as well. So I would say, in conclusion, with all of these factors, Jordan's experience was typical or normal grief, not complicated grief, like we'll get into in the next module. So John Bowlby, who's famous for attachment theory, is also known for grief, and he is one of the earliest models about grieving, and it was a stage model. Obviously, we've talked about the challenges with stage models, but that initially there would be that numbness, sense of unreality, might outwardly look like we're doing fine, and then waves of distress begin to come, where you're kind of pining, yearning for the person who has died, feeling agitated, ruminating. Disorganization can then emerge as our loneliness and despair sets in, feeling tired, loss of motivation, and then kind of this period of reorganization, of personal growth, trying to figure out who are we now, how do I fit in with others. So for example, we're going to be getting into a reading later on motherless daughters, but if your mom has died, right, how does that change your identity? Now I'm part of women who mother isn't living, and what's that like when other people, talk about their moms? So I'm going to read on these next couple of slides a poem that I wrote over 30 years ago. I was 17. I wrote it for an English assignment my senior year of high school. And so let me get to the slide and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. A little bit about this poem. I think it symbolizes John Bowlby's stages, that kind of starting with the numbness, moving to some yearning, that disorganization, and then the reorganization. I wrote it again based on my own experience as a middle schooler with the death of my beloved cat, who was my best friend, and then having come home during my senior year, right after my mom had found out that my identical twin cousin had been killed in a car crash, and she was just very distraught. So I'm going to read the poem to you. I wrote it like this, with the anguish starting big and then getting smaller. It's just 2 slides here. The anguish is here, now, choking, physical pain, verging on hysteria, the mind racing, jumping, crying, no, no, no. The anguish has slowed down, is taking deep breaths. Breathe, breathe. The mind slows, the face relaxes, the tears start again, this time slowly rocking, the violence subsiding. The anguish is sleeping, exhausted, functioning on reserve energy. The body has taken over, calmly, working methodically. The anguish is awakening, a few seconds of nothingness, normalness, and then flash, the realization of what occurred yesterday. The anguish is no longer alone, but being shared with others. The pain is spreading out. The grief is paired together. The anguish smiles today, once, twice. Body still functions methodically. The mind thinks a little of other things today, former things, before. The anguish tasted food today, talked matter-of-factly today, noticed the outside today and the sun. The anguish went back to life today, normally, thought at brief alone moments of pain, mind had room for other functions, ideas. The anguish is under the surface of the past, something thought about in quiet moments, alone, in silence. The anguish moves on. I actually went on to publish it in my 20s, and it was in a textbook too. I ended up reading it quite a number of places. Okay, so if we aren't doing stage theories of grief, just like we don't do stage theories of dying, and remember we already kind of deconstructed Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and how, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance doesn't quite sum up the whole grief experience. The most current model for thinking about grief is a task model, just like we had tasks of dying. And so we have this task of first accepting the reality of the loss. So we're trying not to deny it or minimize it. We're trying to talk about it with others, talk about how hard it can be to accept. And then we have to move on to experiencing the pain, taking time out. And sorry, I said then, like it's a stage. We also, I should say, have to experience the pain, or as Sandberg and Grant say in the Option B book, we have to lean into the suck. We also have to adjust to the environment without the deceased. So for example, in our everyday functioning, did that person take on roles that we now have to do? Do we need to be responsible, for example, for finances or kids' schedules, and that wasn't something? Is it about our internal adjustment, our new identity, like my husband, like now I'm an orphan? Is it about our spiritual adjustments? We've had to maybe reevaluate our beliefs about afterlife or our values of what's important to us. And then lastly, we create a new relationship with the deceased. This is modified. Worden's task model used to say emotionally relocate. But now, as we're going to talk about, we're more into a continuing bond with loved ones. And so it's this idea of how do we carry them with us, keep their memory alive, keep things that remind us of them. Okay, so related to that final task of Worden's is this concept of a continuing bonds framework. This happened in the 1990s, so it's now been like 30-ish years. This framework was developed. It's been more predominant in collectivist cultures forever, right? This ancestor worship that you may experience in some of your families, but in individualistic cultures like the United States, we had this like cut off and move on idea. Freud termed it deconthexis. But we've started to become more accepting of the idea that it's not unhealthy. It can be healthy to continue to have a relationship with the deceased. We can talk to them, pray to them, right? Remember them, internalize them. Okay, so Robert Niemeyer is a current giant in the field of grief and loss. And one thing that he has focused in on is this idea that following a loss, we do a lot of meaning reconstruction. And so here's this idea that we have a self-narrative, how we're writing our own life story that's the basis of our own identity, and that's changing when we have a significant loss. And so we are kind of restorying. So here's some of the questions that he would have if, for example, grief counselors help clients to explore about how they're kind of incorporating the loss in an ongoing way. Okay, another favorite framework of mine is the dual process model of loss. This is Strobe and Schutt. It also came out in the mid-1990s and was fairly revolutionary. It's basically saying that it's impossible to grieve 24/7. And people are going to go back and forth between being loss focused and then being restoration focused, or I call it life focused, right? And so sometimes you're going to be grieving intensely. You've got anniversaries coming up, or you're still processing the loss. But then other times you're going to have to be doing things like your work, or errands, or taking care of kids, or just kind of normal daily life activities, and you might not be actively experiencing the loss. So people can feel guilty when they are being more life focused, and so it's okay to normalize for people that you can't grieve 24/7. You are going to move back and forth between loss focused and life focused. So that's a useful thing to share. Here's a test yourself question. Normal reactions to loss include, and of this answer would be anger. We're going to be getting more into this in complicated grief, but major depressive disorder, complicated grief, not experiencing grief at all, or having phobias would be considered maybe more associated with complicated grief than normal or typical grief. So what does resolution of grief look like, if such a thing exists? So it seems to entail some constructions of, a new life, new reality. Also just this idea that, grief is dynamic. There may not be ever an end. That we find ourselves more future-oriented than past-oriented. When a loved one dies, it's right in our face for a long time. And it takes a while, especially the end of their life, it takes a while for the rest of our life to kind of move more to the forefront. We can talk more about closure, but that's controversial in the grief field. I kind of think of it as like forgiveness, right? It's not necessarily that you ever get it 100%. You just kind of maybe get it in degrees. Creation of kind of meaning over time, like we talked about with Robert Niemeyer's work, and again, that continuing bond idea. So I'd encourage you to ponder, do you believe in the goal of closure? Is that something you're trying to get to? Do people get to it? And how do you know if someone has done their grief work?